Welcome back to second day of our conference on corporate communication. Those of you who are joining us, welcome. I appreciate you getting up early on the second day. I know it was a beautiful day in New York yesterday, and it portends to be a beautiful day today, but because you can't see outside, I want to keep you inside for the conversation. So this is a conversation that we have set up between Ray Kotcher, who is directly in front of me, and
Good morning.
Stuart Smith, who is to my left. These gentlemen are representative of agencies and where they are going. Ray is the non-executive chairman of Kotcher. And he was the global CEO of Kotcher for 12 years, and in that tenure, Kotcher grew 3 times its size.
Who's counting?
Who's counting? Obviously, somebody in the accounting office is counting at how large it grows. He's been a force in the public relations profession as the chair of the Council of Public Relations Firms and a trustee of the Institute for Public Relations. He's moving into his next career as a college professor at a small university in Boston, not Harvard, but Boston University as a practice chair. For all of you BU,
all right.
BU graduates in the
Golden Warriors.
I didn't think we'd get something from that, but at any rate, a great institution, as good as we are at Baruch, but we welcome you here. And Stuart Smith is now the global CEO of Ogilvy Public Relations, and has held that position for 2 years now.
Yes.
Before that, he was the CEO of Edelman UK. You'll notice from Stuart's accent that he is not from around here, but he has become a New Yorker since coming here. He is responsible for all of the programs that Ogilvy Public Relations has throughout the world with organizations that you probably have heard about, such as Nestle, Reed Smith, Merck, Anglo-American, and Amex. This is the conversation that I've invited Ray and Stuart to have. They are going to make some statements about what they see as the future of our profession as we go forward. So I'm going to turn it over to our guests.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. And good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation.
My pleasure.
Stuart and I have been talking with one another, very excited to be here this morning. Of course, I'll allow him to speak for himself, but we decided to allow me to kick it off. And what we're going to try to do today is discuss what's going on in the public relations business, and particularly taking a look at what's happening in the world of the Chief Communications Officer and how that is impacting the agency business. That was Michael's original ask, and that's how we've been focusing our discussion for this morning. And kind of want to take a look at it as almost an inverted pyramid. Take a look at what are the macro trends that we see out there. What are the global trends out there in business, in society, and what are the concerns of chief executives and of people leading major institutions. Then take that down to how does the corporate communicator respond, and then how does the agency then support the corporate communicator. Fair summary, Stuart? Okay.
No, absolutely.
Okay. So let's begin with telescoping all the way out to what we see happening out there on a macro basis. And I'm just going to tick these off. I'm not going to get into great detail on any of these. I think many of these, I know many of you are researchers. You look into these things deeply. You're watching these things, and you see them. And if you're not researching them, we live them. Not only in business, but we live them as citizens of the world and citizens of the countries that would come from. The speed of change, just blinding. Again, these are macro trends. These are issues, challenges out there that we all need to be looking at, and institutions particularly, and top management CEOs. Sustainability, particularly if you're a manufacturing business, access to resources and the quality of those resources. Cybersecurity and privacy issues, big issue, well, around the world, but particularly in Europe right now, the privacy issue. Diminishing confidence in institutions of all types, whether it's government, whether it's religion, whether it's business. Hyper-transparency, everybody knows everything, whenever they want to know it. Activist stakeholders, people want to be involved. They're watching, they're concerned, they want a voice. The rise of the developing markets. Stuart spent a tremendous amount of time in Asia, but beyond Asia, looking at Africa today, and looking at mass migration. These major shifts in economics and major shifts in populations are going to have a profound effect on our world and on our institutions. The global dialogue that we're in, and this is all about a global dialogue. Social media, of course, and I don't know whether that should be at the top or the bottom of the list or somewhere in the middle, but I think that impacts everything. And influencers, and perhaps I would group that with the activists and the shareholders and the stakeholders, but influencers out there. Corporate social responsibility, the transparency that is out there, the hyper-transparency that we're living with, makes social purpose and makes the public concern extremely important. At a time when every constituency knows what every institution is doing, how those institutions behave really matters today, more than ever. So those are kind of the top line meta trends, you might want to call them, that are out there. I have more research here, and I'll just spend a moment on this, and then then we'll flip it over to Stuart for a moment. But I just want to spend a moment. There were some, and many of you are researchers, so I'm sure you're familiar with a number of these studies. KPMG, PwC, the Said School at Oxford University, and Heidrick have all done important research into the concerns of chief executives, and many of them have then taken a look at what the impact is on communications in those organizations. So about a year ago, KPMG puts out a report, I believe, every year. What were some of the top concerns? This is not inclusive by any means. You couldn't fit it all on a small index card like this. But what were some of the top concerns, and what were some of the relevant concerns to us in this room of chief executive officers? Customer loyalty, competitive threats, new entrants into their businesses, and technological disruption of their businesses. Employees, retalenting employees. As their businesses change, how do they retalent their companies? How do they align their employees? Change management. Geographic growth, we touched on before. Regulations, both in the countries that you're in and across the border. If you're doing business in a new country, how do you start navigating a new world of regulations, a new body of regulatory demands? PwC rolled this out at Davos in January. This is pretty fresh stuff. The top CEO concerns, and again, not inclusive, growth. Operating in society, shareholder expectations. Measuring and proving performance, and not always on the hard financial metrics, but around business strategy. How can I measure and prove that my business strategy is making sense and is working? How can I measure and prove that the values of our company make sense? How can I measure and prove that the purpose of our company makes sense? And then 50% of them, this is the PwC Davos January study, 50% cited how they brand their companies as a top concern. So half of them are talking about the communications and branding of their companies. Again from PwC, and then I'll just briefly go to the Said Oxford study. Again from PwC. CEOs see the need for consistent, dependable communications. They see the need for transparency and trust. They think that's critical. The Said Oxford study, which is great, and there's plenty of YouTube on it if you haven't seen it. It's a good study. It was done with Heidrick. It's about a year old. Speed of change. Listen to this one. A CEO speaking, my personal growth. I have no training to be the communicator in chief. Again, from Said, Oxford, there are more audiences, more languages, more modes. How do I deal with this? So that's kind of the macro environment that we're in now. We enter the world of the CCO, enter the world of the agency, and how do we begin to help and support and make sense of all this that's going on out there?
Thank you. Right. I mean, I don't know whether this is going to flow in a completely linear sort of way, but for those that have seen my CV, I'm a bit of an academic turned PR creative sort of person. So I think it's really interesting to speak with academics because I think the industry is in quite a lot of turmoil and change in a really good way, not in an uncontrolled, crazy sort of way. And I think there needs to be a meeting of people who are looking at the theory of communications and the people practicing it at the moment. We probably need that conversation more than we've ever needed before, based on what Ray's saying and what hopefully I'm going to say. I think the industry has changed. The PR industry in general has changed a lot. I think if we look back about, say, 10 years ago, we had sort of ended up in a situation where we'd become really quite narrowly defined as an industry. But if you go back another 10 or 15 years to probably the time when Ray and I entered the profession, when I went into an agency called Burson Marsteller, it had public relations over the door, but inside there was an advertising agency, the largest direct marketing campaign in the UK, a creative department, a research and planning department, and we did speak to some journalists and some politicians and some stakeholders at the same time. And it's almost as if somehow we allowed ourselves as a profession to be very narrowly defined. And now actually, in my view, we're sort of coming back to the future. And we're finding sort of PR agencies re-diversifying back into skill sets and into areas which they previously had. Interestingly, I think that if you look at the sort of the institutional communications, as Ray would call it, the corporate communications work, and then there was always something called brand PR as well. And I think, again, 10, 15 years ago, that was seen as something that was nice to do, but from an agency point of view, it was fairly sort of low rent, the margins weren't very good, and it wasn't somehow as important as all the institutional stuff and public affairs work and the crisis work that other people were doing. I think, again, the situation is inverted. There is a huge importance now on B2C communications, and Ray and I were talking a little bit about how PR is evolving and how, on the one hand, we have the CCO. I mean, I'm a corporate communications practitioner myself, but I'm sitting inside a very B2C, very creative-led, integrated agency. And I think that what we see now is that the CCO has all the most difficult jobs that they've always had, and it's getting more and more complex. But interestingly, the corporate communications function was largely designed to help communicate very complicated topics to very small groups of highly influential stakeholders. And actually, on the other hand, the CMO wants to communicate one very compelling, highly beautifully honed idea to large groups of consumers using all sorts of channels. And I think 10 years ago, PR was not seen, or what is currently still called PR, was not seen as a particularly important part of the marketing mix by the CMO. But because of all the changes that Ray's talked about, because of all the changes that you know in the industry, the CMO's never been more interested in what we do. They may not always call it PR. They may call it social. They may call it content. They may want an authentic campaign. They may want to reach people in a way that they've never reached before, but they certainly want to move away from what some people, or what my 9-year-old daughter would call shouty marketing. You know, they want something which is a little bit more authentic, something that's very, very engaging. So I think we're living through quite a shift in the way that the industry is moving. I think back in 20 years ago, we went through cycles. You know, agencies had primacy; they were leading the clients. We knew more about PR than clients did. Then people from the agencies started to move in-house. I was one of them, and suddenly became a little bit smarter than the agency. The agencies had to up their game a little bit. But for a while, clients were leading the agencies until the agencies caught up. To be quite honest, at this moment, I don't think I think agencies and clients are all leading themselves. There's so much churn and so much change in the industry. There's never really been a more interesting time. And to be quite honest, that's why when Ogilvy tapped me on the shoulder and asked me to move over, I realised that I had been doing more work with advertising agencies and creative agencies than actually my own PR colleagues. And I thought that, you know, while the disciplines are collapsing, while everything is changing in the way that we're going to talk a bit about, I thought the safest place to be, the most interesting place to be, would be inside a sort of an integrated communications lab called Ogilvy, where I could try and figure out what the role of PR might be in the future, not just for CMOs, but also from a chief communications officer's point of view. Because I think we are going to live in a world where it's, I think we were saying yesterday, it's sort of bifurcated. Mm-hmm. I think that's enough. Is that enough? I'll stop there for a tick.
Okay. So, both of you see this amazing change, and you see the profession as moving in a direction that is, as you said, back to the future, and it's more integrated. Could you elaborate on that in more detail? I mean, we've had the larger macro look at this. How does that work out when you are working with multinational corporations, sovereign wealth funds, governments, the organizations that you deal with?
Well, interestingly, I think that I have a point of view, I suppose, that as we bifurcate a little bit, the practice of corporate communications has to modernise. It has to become more social, more creative, more content-led. And in fact, corporate communications needs to steal a bit of the armoury that marketing has always used. I remember interviewing some people in Brussels for a job to run our Brussels agency, and there was a woman who came from a very large American company who was the chief communications officer, public affairs lobbyist, basically, in Brussels. And I said, why would you want to come and join Ogilvy? And she said, well, I'm so bored just doing these straightforward stakeholder programs. I think that we need the creativity in how we lobby, because the standard practice is just not cutting through. Mm-hmm. So if lobbyists are even saying we need to get creative about how we change people's opinions, I think we need to steal some of marketing's clothes, even in the traditional corporate space. And on the CMO side, they want content and programs which are more authentic and more influential. So I think we're seeing lots of different things happening. Ray and I were talking about this. You know, we have CCO clients and we have CMO clients, and everything is true. There's nothing you could ask me and say, is this true? I'll say yes, because it will be true with one company with a particular CCO and a particular CMO. But we're seeing companies trying to work out how marketing and PR fits together. I do think there are some CMOs that are looking at chief communications officers and their departments and saying, I really need more of what you're doing. And they're thinking one of two things. One is, you're not up to the job, you don't know how to scale it. And, oh, you understand what I'm trying to do, you can scale it. So, you know, and that's leading to a lot of sort of churn and change on the client side. And I think, I don't know whether I can speak for Ray, but I'm getting involved in helping both sides of that equation deliver communications programs.
And you roll that back up to the concerns of the chief executive that we were talking about before, not necessarily just a private enterprise, but any large institutions, and institutional the work that public relations has traditionally done, that corporate communications has traditionally done in building institutional reputation and trust is high on a top executive's list today. And so this is a very interesting moment that Stuart was talking about at a time when we're working more closely with our marketing colleagues and doing a tremendous amount of everyday work with them. How do we make sure that we also continue to look after the institutional interests as well?
It's very interesting that you focused on trust, building trust, reputation as something that you work with your clients on. I've always found that those intangibles are very difficult to manage. Could you speak a little bit about that? And some of the, and you don't have to name names of the companies that you work with, but the ones that are successful at perpetuating a positive reputation and ones that may have lost their way over the years, that had great reputations, that were sustainable companies, may have been 100 years in business. Lehman Brothers comes to mind.
Yep.
As a company that had been around for over 100 years and then lost it in a heartbeat. And I think that reputation is ephemeral in a lot of ways, but that's, as you said, it's a hot topic. How do we create and manage that, and how do you work with clients to do that?
Let me take a shot at that one. I think that if you go back to the very beginnings of the development of public relations and corporate communications in this country anyway, and certainly take a look at the work of Harold Burson and what he is saying today. The public relations, and he's very insistent on using the term public relations as opposed to corporate communications. And his reason being is that public relations is really about an institution's behavior and then communicating that behavior. And if you get the behavior right, then the communications can follow. If it's discordant, if it's not resonant, if those things are not resonant with one another, it creates dissonance. And that's where the problem begins. One company that I have great admiration for, not a Ketchum client, but my goodness, they are doing so many things right, is Starbucks. Mm-hmm. And it starts at the top. Take a look at that company. It's a company that had lost its way. Mm-hmm. The founder came back, said, we're going to really think about this. We're going to get back to the essence of who we are. He's very concerned about the sourcing of his product, fair trade, environmental issues, the involvement of his retail shops at the local level, getting engaged in important societal conversations and using the stores as a conduit or a channel for that conversation. And of course, making good coffee. Well, I think it is anyway. And it's led to record financial results. They just reported their results, I don't know, for the first quarter of this year. Blew it away. So there is a company that is making smart business decisions, yes. Serving great coffee, yes. But it's that other stuff that matters, that they really execute against, that is making a big difference in terms of how their customers and employees feel about them and how the world looks at them.
Can I build on what you were saying?
Sure,
you mentioned a word earlier, which was hyper-transparency. And I think it's worth talking about what's pushing marketing and PR closer together. And it is hyper-transparency. I think all the data that I see on different brands that come through from the CMO side, from the consumer side, consumers are more concerned now about the corporate reputation or the character of the organisation that they're buying products from than they've ever been. Obviously driven by hyper transparency, social, digital, and all the things that we know and love. And that's what's got the CMO interested in what we do. And it's got them very interested in how well we actually manage the character and reputation of the organisation. That's what's causing the conversations inside, on the client side, between the CCO and the CMO. I mean, I'm using those phrases rather sort of loosely. And that's what's causing the interesting blending and merging of the disciplines. Is why they want a little bit more of what we do, and it's causing a shift in the CCO side, because we talk the language of reputation, they talk the language of brand. When we say media, we mean journalists. When they say media, they mean an ad buy. There's a language barrier. There's a technology barrier. There's a sort of intellectual framework barrier. And what I hope people like Kotcher and Ogilvy and others are trying to do is trying to create some lingua franca between the disciplines, so that we can all do what we do best to build the reputation and frankly help sales as well, which is sort of what the two sides of the shop do.
You don't mind if I take notes, do you? That's a great point.
You both mentioned, Stuart, you mentioned character, and Ray, you mentioned, not by name, but Howard Schultz as the leader and the founder at Starbucks.
Yeah.
And there's I think the unsaid, well, you said behavior, character, the leader, all of those things are important to a positive reputation. What happens when you have an organization that doesn't have a Howard Schultz, that doesn't have a positive, strong character or ethic or set of values? I guess what I'm saying is that the precursor to having a good reputation would be to have what used to be called, maybe 30 years ago, but is coming back, a strong corporate culture. And would you work with an organization that comes to you, they're having problems, they don't have a strong culture? Would you even take that on as a client?
It would be very expensive, wouldn't it, Ray?
That's really what change management is about.
Right. Okay. Yeah, exactly. Okay.
And change management is, again, when we talk about the marketing, communications, the branding, and the institutional elements of communications, institutional reputation in communications today, change management is an important part of the institutional reputation portfolio, and it's growing very quickly. It is not, now that said, it is not just public relations agencies that are providing that. You've got the large consulting firms like the PwCs, like the KPMGs,
McKinsey's, right?
Yeah, and the large
McKinsey's and
the McKinsey, the Towers, the big HR consulting firms are providing that as well. So it's change management and creating that alignment between what a company's strategy and purpose is, and then getting the behaviors to follow that, and then communicating as part of that is highly important today, and is a rapidly growing part of not only the agency business, but it's a very big part of what communicators inside companies are doing today. If you take a look at, there's an Arthur Page study that just was published, which is called
the
new CCO. I don't know if you've covered it.
World Page, yeah.
Yeah, if you've covered it here, but transforming enterprises in a changing world. And when you take a look at the 5 top findings, they are saying that that there are new job roles and new job descriptions. Culture czar is one that was noted in the report. Engagement designer, engagement leaders, and it can be internal and external, but so much of this now is behavioral scientists. is something. So there are new roles, and there are new job descriptions, and there are new charges being given to the corporate communicator today.
I don't want to be selfish. I know the audience has lots of questions. You've been very patient. Do you mind if we open this up for questions for the last
Please.
15 minutes? So, questions from all of you. We have one here, and one here. We have a mic. Would it help with the microphone or not?
I can speak pretty
Okay.
I can hear you.
And your name and
I'm Dan Laufer. I'm the head of School of Marketing and International Business at Victoria University in New Zealand, in Wellington.
welcome.
Thank you. I have a question related to political marketing, communications, and Donald Trump.
Who?
Sorry, is that the time? I've really got to go.
I haven't heard of him.
We've gone almost an hour without mentioning that.
I want to focus on it from a communication standpoint and the effectiveness of communications and kind of changes over time in, I guess, the effectiveness of political communications and his success. And I was very curious to hear your views on that. The repetitiveness of messaging.
You don't have to be political if you don't want to, but it's.
Oh, listen, I'm the Brit. Yeah, you got to take the first bite at that one.
Sure. You know, I will not make a political statement here, but I don't think that we should be all that surprised at what's happening here. If you take a look at the way Obama ran his campaigns, his first and his second campaigns, and he identified constituencies that were extremely important to him in terms of winning the election. He mobilized social media in a way that really had never been seen before to reach those audiences. And he resonated with those audiences. And not only did he get their vote, he got people out to vote who hadn't voted before. So talk about behavioral change. And if that is the highest purpose of what we do in the communications world is driving behavioral change, he certainly created the roadmap, or his campaign did, and him, in how to drive a campaign in a very different way than had ever been done before. Now, regardless of what you think of Trump and his politics, he's done the same thing. He's tapped into a constituency. He's tapped into a zeitgeist in his constituency. He's tapped into concerns, fears, and he's doing it much in the same way. So I don't think that I don't think that the techniques are all that different. I think Trump has taken the use and the application of social media to a level that we've never ever seen before. I mean, and is much more not only not perhaps sophisticated, but much more intuitive about it than anybody that I think we've seen before.
He's broken a lot of rules, though, hasn't he? I mean, if we'd read the campaign tactics in advance as PR people and said, "Oh my God, you're not really going to do that, are you?" I mean, there's a lot of rules that he's broken. I mean, I'm looking at it sort of dispassionately, as you say. I mean, I'm not talking about the politics of what he's saying or how he's saying it, but he appears to be breaking some rules, and actually that's sending a lot of the sort of the standard political communications campaign model people sort of running for cover, not quite knowing how to get control back of the news cycle. When he's breaking all those rules, and that was my main take out observing this for the first time sitting here in the country rather than sort of reading about the primaries from 3,000 miles away.
I guess my point is that the people who support him believe so deeply in what he's doing that that breaking the rules is okay, because that's probably part of what his brand is about.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay. Sonia, you had a question?
Yes, I do. I've done similar. Sorry, I'm Sonia Verwey. I'm the head of school at the School of Communication at the University of Johannesburg. And I've done similar research amongst agencies in South Africa, seeing how they're meeting the challenges. And my sense really is that they're not. And I'm asking you whether, in fact, you do feel that agencies are rising to the challenge. And I do have a question as to whether, in fact, they are really able to meet the challenges in terms of the context in which business has to function. The number one complaint that the agency or that the business owners have is that agencies do not understand their business and therefore are unable to advise them on a strategic level. And a lot of what you've been saying as to the challenges, and even if you look at PR as behavior, it goes to the purpose of the organization. And I'm not sure that agencies are, I think they're so used to doing execution and perhaps not really functioning at a strategic level. And I would be interested to know whether you think that the agencies are able to actually meet the challenges in these contexts.
I'm happy to take a bite of that.
It's interesting. I mean, I would agree with you in some markets. I mean, I think the practice of PR is still relatively young. Harold's a sprightly 90 whatever years old he is, and I started there. So the industry is still quite young, and we've got, so that's one dimension. It's still a young industry. It's still developing. It's still growing. It's growing at different speeds in different markets, and those markets have different expectations of PR. And I think it's sort of, it's very, again, almost anything can be true, can be said to be true about PR in some market. It depends on the sector, the client, whatever. I do think that PR, as it matures in the market, as it develops, does get a more strategic role and does start to develop a strategic capability. But it's the role of the industry in that market to make sure that it doesn't get boxed into that sort of executional kind of role. And I think the new CCO paper from the Page Society, Ray and I were just discussing earlier, as CCOs, we have been, because I've been one, we have always been trying to make what we do more important to the company and more relevant to the CEO and more relevant to the CFO. And I think a good CCO is the one that's doing that, and a good agency is the one that's helping the CCO do that.
Yeah, it's interesting that one of our panelists yesterday said it used to be that people were looking for that seat at the table, and then now they're talking about being at the table in the decision-making process. So that's a major change from the beginning of the profession.
There is one. Sorry, there is one other thing on you mentioned PwC. PwC is making a shift in its own business model. PwC has been there mainly to assure the quality, the probity, the stewardship of financial numbers. But they're looking to move, as a number of the other sort of consulting firms are looking to move into sort of assuring trust in other things. And whilst it's very easy for PwC to say the CMO and the CCO spent their budgets correctly and legally, did they spend them effectively? And so we will see, I think, organisations like PwC have an influence in the C-suite and force us to think about measurement in a lot more detail.
Mm-hmm.
That's a subject for a whole conference all on its own on where measurement is going. We've had some panel sessions on that, but I want to get
If I can just one more add-on to Stuart's response to your question. If you take a look at agencies today, I believe that vertical expertise becomes extremely important. So let's telescope back out to some of the CEO concerns: sustainability, health, finance, some of the big meta concerns that are out there. Is your agency equipped to help the top management of the client companies deal with those issues, environment? Number two, is your agency equipped, does it know enough about the vertical sector that that client business is operating in? And then finally, and this will be my last point, something that Stuart and I have been discussing, as you take a look at this institutional reputation work and the marketing work, do we as corporate communicators know enough about marketing to help them and to make that shift, particularly as you take a look at peso, paid, earned, shared, owned, platforms, channels, platforms really. More and more of our work is becoming paid work. It's the way it is in the social world, in the social media world. Are we equipped to live in a world where paid is becoming more important and live in the world of the marketer? And by the way, this is something that Stuart and I had discussed, had a very, very energetic discussion about yesterday. And as researchers, it's a challenge that we would put out to you. Really, that is going to be critical. Is this relationship between those who focus on institutional reputation, those who focus on marketing, and as they come together, what's going to need to happen to make that successful?
Jill, you had a question, and I think Mina would be the last question for.
So that's a perfect lead-in for my question. So I'm Jill Novella. I'm with ESP Vision Care. We're the largest not-for-profit vision benefits company in the U.S. that no one knows about. And we recently just appointed a CCO for the first time in our company's history. So we're trying to figure out what that means and how that does dovetail in with the CMO. So I was curious, with the clients you work with, have you had both, and how do they work together? Do you work with one or the other? Is it more successful when you've seen a CMO that oversees communications or a CCO that also oversees marketing? And then on top of that, where does employee communications typically fall? So right now our employee communications are within HR, which causes a little bit of a strife in terms of who is responsible for what for that internal reputation piece. So I was just curious if you had some thoughts on that.
Very briefly on employee communications, it's fascinating. Again, I think the CMO is getting more interested in employee communications. We've always said that employees can be the best advocate for the brand and all that stuff. I mean, we've seen those essays written for the last 25, 30 years. The truth is that it's only recently become possible for us to give employees a voice through social channels. So suddenly there is a mechanism for the CMO who can see a way in which to activate employee advocates. So we're seeing a huge demand for our particular sort of specialist service, which I know Kotcher delivers as well. We're seeing a huge demand for our employee comms specialists to go along and work with brands when brands are being relaunched or when there's a new sort of campaign internally. We're getting a huge demand through that side of the shop, not interestingly through the CCO side of the shop. I've always found it a little bit of a difficult sell from within PR to HR and CCO because it ends up being a very complicated buying unit. But actually, the moment the CMO gets involved and says, no, we have to activate 5,000 employees, there's a no-brainer, we have to do this. Suddenly you get to do something and it's quite good fun. You know, but again, there are two sides of the shop. There's closing factories or opening factories, and there's getting advocates in stores to help sell something new. So I think that's a really important thing. I talked about agencies and clients leading each other. There's lots of different models. If you look at P&G, if you look at Unilever, if you look at Nestlé, there's lots of different organisations, I don't know about your clients, but who are making different decisions about how to reorganise, merge, subsume. You know, you've got PR people becoming CMOs, you've got CMOs taking control of PR. I mean, everyone's experimenting. I think clients are, and I think we are too.
And that's why we believe that it's really a topic worthy of research. It is the question of the moment.
I want to give our conversation experts time to make a final statement. So I'm sorry that, but you can ask them off and in between. So what would closing remarks that you would have?
Closing remarks.
You're going to be a professor now, starting in, professorial remarks are not necessarily required, but I can see the wheels are turning.
Now, you know, I mean, speaking as a professor and not necessarily related directly to what we're talking about here, but there is an arc back to it. First of all, I'm really jazzed about going up to BU and teaching up there. I believe strongly in the future of our business. And wherever this falls out in marketing, communications, institutional, neither of them are going away. We need to be able to do both and do both very, very well. And I feel a tremendous, I'm tremendously excited about helping that next generation move into their careers, start fulfilling their ambitions and desires, but also helping us move our business, as largely our industry, where it needs to go. I could not be more excited about it. And I'll just finish by, I want to just to answer, to just put some specificity around that. If you take a look, now this is here in the States, the stats, these statistics are here in the States. Take a look at the millennial generation. And these statistics are pretty new. They're probably about exactly a year old. So our Census Bureau put out a report. The millennial cohort in this country now is at 75 million. They eclipse my generation, the baby boomer generation, which is at 60 some odd, 66-ish, if I remember, 66 million in this country, if I remember correctly, and not growing, while the millennials and the Gen Zs coming up behind them are. It's real. The impact is profound, and the thing that, and the one statistic as part of that I think is very interesting, is that of that millennial cohort, of that 75 million, they are 44% diverse. This is going to make all the difference. When they will become 75% of the workforce by 2025, and they're 44% diversity numbers. So I'm extremely excited about the challenges and the opportunities ahead for our business. And I can't wait to get up there and start working with those kids.
Stuart?
And I agree with all that. I think diversity and inclusion as an industry, we have to become more representative of the target audiences that our clients are trying to reach. So I definitely applaud that. Going back to the sort of the academic sort of meets practitioner conversation, we've never needed more help, I think, as a practicing industry, for people thinking about what we do, helping us understand why what we do works and why people are interested in it. Maybe that interface between institutional communications and brand communications, you know, the role of PR in new social content-led marketing is important. I think the industry has to sort of retain its soul. We have to, if we just become social and content agencies, we're just another social and content industry, and we just lose our identity. There is something unique about what we do, which is that we earn the influence, we earn the media, we do not buy it, even though we are purchasing some of it a bit more. But how do we use what is unique about our discipline to help marketing be more authentic, more effective, and connect better with consumers? You know, that's the role of PR going forward, and I do think the industry will bifurcate a little bit, even as it integrates more. So I don't know. I mean, hopefully I'll be around to see how it develops over the next 10 years. I don't think it'll be a fast change. I think there's time, but it's going to take another 10 years, I think, to really see where this ends up.
Well, you both have given all of us insight into what our academic constituents and our professional constituents can do to energize the next generation that is going to be the leaders, as you said, by 2025. The things that they have to deal with, the capabilities that they have to become facile in, and the understanding of the world that they are in is important for us, and it moves the profession from tacticians to theoreticians and strategists in a way that I find, from my position here at Baruch College, exciting and energizing as well. And I want to thank you both for sharing your insight with us and sharing your time this morning. Thank you both.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you, Michael.